Hello everyone. Today I'm going to tell you some stories about cheating. The first story. The crisp morning air nipped at Elena's cheeks as she waited for the commuter train. She pulled her cashmere scarf tighter, the soft wool a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep within her. It wasn't just the weather, it was the guilt, heavy and unforgiving, that clung to her like a second skin. Elena had always prided herself on her stability, her unwavering loyalty. She and Mark had built a life together, brick by painstaking brick, a solid, dependable home filled with quiet evenings and shared dreams. Mark, with his kind eyes and unwavering devotion, was the bedrock of her existence. Or so she thought. Then came David. David was a banker, polished and charismatic, with a smile that could melt glaciers and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He handled Mark's accounts, and they'd met at a business dinner a few months ago. He'd flirted shamelessly, his gaze lingering a beat too long, his compliments laced with a subtle, intoxicating danger. Elena, caught off guard by his blatant admiration, had found herself inexplicably drawn in. It had started innocently enough, lunch dates under the guise of discussing investment strategies, followed by drinks after work, sharing secrets and insecurities she hadn't even realized she'd been harboring. David listened, really listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen, understood, desired. He was everything Mark wasn't: exciting, unpredictable, dangerous. One rainy Tuesday, after a particularly grueling conference call, Elena found herself in David's arms. One kiss led to another, and before she could stop herself, she had crossed a line she never thought she was capable of crossing. The act itself was a whirlwind of passion and adrenaline, followed by an immediate, gut-wrenching remorse. Now, weeks later, the memory of that afternoon haunted her. The silence between her and Mark felt deafening, every shared glance laden with unspoken words. He was still kind, still loving, oblivious to the chasm that had opened between them. The irony was almost unbearable. She had sought excitement, a temporary escape from the mundane, and in its place, she had found a deep, festering ache. Every morning, as she rode the train to her sterile accounting job, she replayed the events in her head, analyzing every decision, every word, every fleeting moment of weakness. She imagined telling Mark, confessing her transgression, but the thought was paralyzing. The pain she would inflict, the life she would shatter, kept her trapped in her own private hell. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Mark came into the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around her, his familiar scent filling her senses. "You seem distant lately," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Everything okay, Elle?" Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she forced a smile and lied, "Just tired, honey. Work's been crazy." Mark squeezed her tighter. "You work too hard. We should take a vacation, just the two of us. Get away from everything." His suggestion was like a knife twisting in her gut. The generosity, the unwavering love in his eyes, was almost unbearable. She knew she didn't deserve him. That night, Elena lay awake, the weight of her secret crushing her. She looked at Mark, sleeping peacefully beside her, his face etched with a quiet contentment. She imagined the devastation that would erupt when he learned the truth, the pain that would cloud those kind eyes. The next morning, on the train platform, she saw David. He was leaning against a pillar, watching her. He smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes. Elena felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The allure, the excitement, had vanished, replaced by a cold, bitter disgust. She realized that David hadn't seen her at all. He had seen a challenge, a conquest. She met his gaze, her eyes hardening. This had to end. She couldn't live like this, suffocated by guilt and fear. That evening, after Mark had gone to bed, Elena sat down at her laptop. With trembling fingers, she typed out an email, a meticulously crafted message outlining David's unethical business practices, his attempts to manipulate her for personal gain. She attached supporting documents she had inadvertently discovered during her work. She sent the email to his superiors at the bank. It wasn't a confession, not in the way she knew Mark deserved. But it was a start. It was a step towards reclaiming her integrity, towards dismantling the web of lies she had woven. It was a desperate attempt to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage she had created. The guilt remained, a constant companion. But with David out of the picture, a sliver of hope began to glimmer. The road ahead would be long and arduous. She knew she had a difficult conversation ahead of her with Mark. But maybe, just maybe, with honesty and unwavering effort, she could begin to rebuild what she had so carelessly broken. The first step was to tell him the truth. The fear was still there, but now, it was overshadowed by a fierce determination to earn his forgiveness, and more importantly, to forgive herself. The second story. The crisp white sheets felt like a mocking accusation against Amelia's skin. She lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, the rhythmic rise and fall of Daniel's chest beside her doing little to soothe the turmoil within. His arm was draped possessively across her waist, a gesture that used to bring comfort, now felt like a suffocating weight. Last night. The opulent suite, the clinking of champagne flutes, the throbbing bass of the hotel bar echoing faintly in the background. It played in her mind like a lurid, unwanted film. Last night, she had crossed a line she never thought she would. Last night, she had slept with Julian, the charismatic and ruthless owner of the Grand Majestic Hotel, her boss. She had started working at the Grand Majestic 3 years ago, a bright-eyed graduate eager to climb the corporate ladder in the hospitality industry. Daniel, her rock, her steady, reliable Daniel, had been her unwavering support. He'd packed her lunches, listened patiently to her work woes, and celebrated every small victory, even when she knew he didn't fully understand the intricacies of her world. Julian had always been present. His sharp eyes, perpetually assessing, were unnerving. He was a master manipulator, radiating an aura of power that both intimidated and fascinated. He'd started with compliments on her work ethic, moved to subtle gestures of appreciation, and finally, the invitation to a private champagne reception. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. The lingering glances, the suggestive comments masked as professional advice, the late-night calls about urgent matters. She had ignored them, dismissed them as par for the course in the high-stakes world of luxury hotels, but last night, trapped in the gilded cage of Julian's charm and the endless flow of champagne, she had succumbed. The loneliness that had been creeping into her marriage, the feeling of being overlooked and taken for granted, had become amplified under Julian's calculated gaze. He had made her feel seen, important, desired. Now, the shame was a crushing weight. She had betrayed Daniel, a man who loved her unconditionally, for a fleeting moment of validation from a man who saw her as nothing more than a conquest. Carefully, she disentangled herself from Daniel's grip and slipped out of bed. The cool air sent a shiver through her. She moved to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. The city lay sprawled before her, a tapestry of twinkling lights, each one a life, a story. And hers was now a mess. She knew she couldn't live with the lie. Honesty, despite the pain it would inflict, was the only path she could see. But how could she tell Daniel? How could she shatter the foundation of their life together? The thought of Julian loomed large. He was a dangerous man, used to getting what he wanted. What if he tried to use this against her? What if he threatened her career, her reputation? As she dressed, the phone on the bedside table buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Last night was unforgettable. Looking forward to seeing you at the hotel. Her stomach churned. This wasn't a one-night mistake. This was a web, and she was caught in the center. She needed a plan. She needed to protect Daniel, and somehow, salvage what was left of her life. She walked into the bathroom and stared at her reflection. The woman staring back was a stranger, haunted and weary. But beneath the surface, a flicker of resolve began to grow. She had made a terrible mistake, but she wouldn't let it define her. She would fight for her marriage, for her future, even if it meant facing the consequences of her actions, and exposing Julian for the manipulative predator he was. Taking a deep breath, she knew the road ahead would be agonizing. But one thing was certain, this was her story now, and she would write the ending, no matter how painful it might be. The first step: telling Daniel the truth. The third story. The humid Georgia air hung heavy, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and regret. Sarah swirled the bourbon in her glass, the ice clinking a lonely melody against the crystal. Outside, crickets chirped their relentless chorus, a constant reminder of the unchanging rhythm of her life, a rhythm she'd shattered. 5 years married to David. 5 years of comfortable routines, predictable love, and stifling sameness. David, with his kind blue eyes and unwavering optimism, was the rock she'd clung to after a turbulent youth. He'd offered stability, a safe harbor in the storm. But safe, she was beginning to realize, could also feel like a gilded cage. Then came the business trip. Tokyo. David, swamped with work at his law firm, had encouraged her to go alone. "You deserve a break, honey," he'd said, kissing her forehead. "Enjoy the culture, take some pictures, bring me back some sake." She'd intended to. She'd even brought a meticulously researched itinerary, filled with temples and gardens. But then she met Kenji. He was an architect, his eyes as dark and deep as the Tokyo night sky. He wasn't flashy, not like the businessmen she'd seen clamoring for attention. Kenji was quiet, thoughtful, and possessed a quiet intensity that drew her in. He showed her a different side of Tokyo, beyond the tourist traps and neon lights. He took her to hidden ramen shops, ancient shrines tucked away in quiet alleyways, and introduced her to the delicate art of calligraphy. With Kenji, Sarah felt like she was truly seeing, truly experiencing, the world for the first time. He listened with genuine interest when she spoke, unlike David, who often seemed to hear only what he expected to hear. He saw her, really saw her, beneath the layers of suburban wife and dutiful homemaker. Their connection was electric, a silent conversation that crackled in the air between them. It was inevitable, she told herself, that it would ignite. One rain-soaked night, standing beneath the crimson glow of a temple gate, they kissed. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and tasted of sake and desperation. The affair burned bright and fast, a forbidden indulgence that consumed her. It was a reckless act, a rebellion against the humdrum of her life. It was also, she knew with a cold dread in the pit of her stomach, a betrayal of the man who loved her unconditionally. Back in Georgia, the memories of Tokyo clung to her like a second skin. She found herself withdrawn, distant from David. The guilt was a constant gnawing ache, making it hard to breathe, to sleep, to even look David in the eye. He noticed, of course. "Something wrong, honey?" he'd ask, his brow furrowed with concern. She'd brush it off, blaming jet lag, a cold, anything to avoid the truth. Tonight, however, the truth felt like a festering wound that needed to be lanced. The lie had become unbearable. She looked out at the fireflies dancing in the twilight, their fleeting lights a metaphor for the fleeting pleasure she'd found in Kenji's arms. She turned back to the living room, where David was reading, the gentle lamplight illuminating his kind face. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "David," she began, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of the confession pressed down on her, choking her. "There's something I need to tell you." The crickets continued their relentless chorus, the sound amplifying the deafening silence that followed. She knew, with chilling certainty, that her life was about to change forever. The safe harbor she'd known for 5 years was about to be shattered, and she, with her own hands, was the one wielding the hammer. The humid Georgia air suddenly felt colder, the scent of honeysuckle turning acrid in her throat. The taste of regret, bitter and metallic, filled her mouth, the aftermath of a choice made across the ocean, a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. And all she could do now was face the consequences. The fourth story. The cherry blossoms were falling, a pink snowstorm against the gray Kyoto sky. Kenji, usually soothed by the ephemeral beauty, felt only a tightening in his chest. He stood on the narrow bridge over the Shirakawa Canal, the murmur of the water a constant, mocking reminder of the silence that had fallen between him and Hana. He'd been coming to Gion for years, lured by the ancient rituals and the mystique of the geisha. It was a world apart from the sterile precision of his corporate life, a world of silk and whispered secrets. He'd always kept a respectful distance, appreciating the artistry, the performance. Until he met Hannah, his wife, Hannah. The memory of her laughter, the way her dark eyes used to sparkle when he surprised her with a small gift, stabbed at him. He squeezed the bridge railing, the cold iron a sharp counterpoint to the heat of shame that flushed his face. It had started subtly. Compliments to a certain geisha, a young apprentice named Akari, on her improving shamisen playing. Then, a private dinner, arranged ostensibly to discuss a business contact she knew. Wine flowed, the melodic cadence of Akari's voice lulled him, and before he knew it, he was falling. Akari was everything Hannah wasn't anymore. She was attentive, eager to please, and seemed to hang on his every word. He knew it was an illusion, a carefully crafted persona designed to entertain, but the temptation had been too strong. He'd allowed himself to be swept away. One night, after a particularly lavish dinner, he'd stayed with Akari. The memory was a burning ember in his gut. A single act of betrayal that had shattered the foundation of his marriage. He hadn't planned to tell Hannah. He could have kept it a secret, buried it deep. But the guilt had eaten at him, festering like a wound. He'd confessed, the words tumbling out in a choked rush, the shame making him unable to meet her eyes. Hannah had remained unervingly calm. No tears, no raised voice. Just a slow, deliberate dismantling of the life they had built together. She moved out of their shared bedroom, retreating behind a barricade of silence. When she did speak, it was only about practical matters, the house, the finances, the divorce. Kenji had tried to apologize, to explain, but his words felt hollow, inadequate against the magnitude of his transgression. He was adrift in a sea of his own making. He'd stopped going to Gion, the vibrant nightlife now a constant reminder of his betrayal. He spent his evenings alone, the silence of his apartment amplifying the hollowness within him. One afternoon, a small, lacquered box arrived, delivered by a solemn-faced courier. Inside was a single, perfect white camellia, Hannah's favorite flower. He recognized the subtle fragrance of the incense she used in her tea ceremony. There was no note, no indication of who had sent it. He spent hours staring at the flower, its pristine beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness he had unleashed. Was it a gesture of forgiveness? A final farewell? He didn't know. Driven by a desperate need for clarity, he went to Hannah's new apartment. He found her tending a small bonsai tree on her balcony, her back to him. "Hannah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She turned, her face composed, her eyes holding no trace of the joy he remembered. "Kenji," she acknowledged, her voice cool and distant. He opened his mouth to speak, to plead, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "I received your confession," she said, her gaze fixed on the miniature tree. "I have thought about it. A lot." He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I believe you are genuinely sorry," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "But sorrow does not erase what happened. It does not rebuild trust once it is broken." She met his eyes, her gaze piercing. "You went seeking something outside of our marriage, something you felt you were missing. And you found it, however briefly, in the arms of another woman. It was a mistake, Hannah," he pleaded. "A moment of weakness." "A moment of weakness," she repeated, the words hanging in the air like a death knell. "A moment that cost us everything." She turned back to her bonsai, carefully pruning a tiny branch. "I am filing for divorce, Kenji. I wish you well. But I cannot, and will not, go back." He stood there, the cherry blossoms swirling around him, the city sounds fading into a dull hum. He had come seeking absolution, but he had found only confirmation of his profound and irreparable loss. He had traded a lifetime of genuine love for a fleeting illusion, and in doing so, he had lost everything. The beauty of Kyoto, the scent of cherry blossoms, the whisper of the wind, they held no solace for him. He was alone in the world, haunted by the ghost of the love he had destroyed. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that the punishment for his betrayal was not just the loss of Hannah, but the burden of living with the knowledge of what he had done, forever. The fifth story, the scent of lavender couldn't quite mask the acrid tang of mercury that clung to Alara's clothes. She slipped into the cottage, the latch clicking softly behind her, hoping against hope that Gareth was still lost in his books. He wasn't. He sat by the fire, a stoic statue carved from worry. His normally bright blue eyes were dull, the flickering flames reflecting in them like trapped embers. "You're late," he said, his voice a low rumble. Alara's carefully constructed facade of nonchalance trembled. "The market was crowded," she offered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She avoided his gaze, fussing with the shawl that hadn't protected her from the sharp autumn wind. Gareth didn't respond. He simply watched her, a silent, dissecting gaze that made her skin crawl. They had been married for 8 years, 8 years of shared dreams woven into the tapestry of their simple life. He was a weaver, his hands calloused but capable of creating intricate beauty from the simplest threads. He loved her with a quiet, steadfast devotion that she, in her youthful restlessness, had often taken for granted. "Did you see Master Valerius today?" he finally asked, the question hanging in the air like a poisoned dart. Alara froze. Valerius. The alchemist. He was everything Gareth wasn't: flamboyant, intellectual, and brimming with an intoxicating, dangerous knowledge. He was a whirlwind of exotic spices and shimmering elixirs, a world away from Gareth's loom and the familiar comfort of their routine. He needed a specific dye, she stammered, her fingers twisting the worn fabric of her skirt. "A shade of indigo, for an experiment he's conducting." Gareth stood, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the room. He was a head taller than her, and in that moment, he felt like a giant, looming over her transgression. "And that required you to spend the afternoon with him? Behind locked doors?" The truth, sharp and undeniable, punctured the flimsy shield of her lies. She couldn't meet his eyes. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." The sound that escaped Gareth's lips was not a shout, nor a sob, but a low, guttural moan of pain. He turned away, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to age him years in an instant. He walked to the window, staring out at the encroaching darkness. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "What does he have that I don't?" Alara didn't know. It hadn't been about love, not really. It had been about a fleeting desire to touch something extraordinary, to feel the thrill of the forbidden. Valerius had offered her a glimpse of a world beyond their humble cottage, a world of power and possibility. But in that fleeting moment of reckless abandon, she had shattered the foundation of her own. I was foolish," she choked out, tears stinging her eyes. "I don't know what I was thinking." Gareth remained silent, his back still turned. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I went to see him today." Alara gasped. "You what?" "I knew. I suspected. I went to ask him, why." The image of Gareth, humble and unassuming, confronting the enigmatic alchemist filled Alara with a wave of shame. "What did he say?" Gareth slowly turned around, his face pale and drawn. He said he was experimenting. That you were a key ingredient in his pursuit of the philosopher's stone." Alara recoiled as if struck. She had been a pawn in Valerius's game, a tool to be used and discarded. The allure of the extraordinary evaporated, leaving behind only the bitter taste of betrayal and the crushing weight of her own stupidity. "He's lying," she cried, desperate to salvage what little dignity she had left. "He's trying to hurt you." Gareth simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "Is he?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was broken. She had betrayed her husband, been used by the alchemist, and in the process, destroyed the only life she had ever truly known. The scent of lavender, once comforting, now felt like a suffocating reminder of her transgression. As the fire crackled and sputtered in the hearth, Alara realized that she had performed a dangerous alchemy of her own, transforming love into ashes and leaving only the bitter residue of regret. And unlike Valerius, she possessed no magic to reverse the process.